Welcome to another episode of Straight Outta Crampton. And incidentally, I went for lunch the other day with Big Trev, the gentleman whose wife came up with a Straight Outta Crampton. Lovely bloke, wouldn't like to upset him, 6'9", and a nice guy. Anyway, thanks for that. I enjoyed lunch. This episode is called The Wolf's in Charge of the Sheep. I was on the phone, but that didn't stop the two guys walking into my office. And as soon as I put down the receiver, the one carrying the brown paper bag threw it onto my desk in front of me. In my head, I'd already stereotyped them, and my dislike was instant. Mr. D. Centers. That's for you if you let him have your first Mercedes SLK, he said. I knew there'd be cash inside the bag, but as I pushed it back towards him, I replied, thanks, but I've already had my lunch. You can buy a lot of lunches with what's in there, pal. There's 10 grand, and it's yours when we pick the car up. Now, £10,000 is a lot of money, but to put it into perspective, it was less than my yearly bonus, which I would lose if I got caught. I'm a man of principle, and although I'd been offered plenty, I'd never taken any bribes in my life. I despise these men even more for thinking they could just walk into my office and buy me. I wanted to say, I'm not your pal, and you know what you can do with your money. But I didn't. Instead, I made the excuse that the cars were allocated at our head office from our pre-existing order bank, and that I had nothing to do with it. I didn't want them to think they could persuade me in other ways which wouldn't quite be as pleasant as spending £10,000. So it was important that I removed myself from the equation. And also not to shift the onus onto any of my other reachable colleagues. He snatched the bag up and said, you'll be sorry. I'm already sorry. That 10 grand would have come in really handy, I said, as I showed them to the door. There was a massive premium to be had on the first SLKs. I'd taken orders for 5 years' supply, though I'd soon lost interest in delivering them when my employer limited us to £50 commission each vehicle. He said that selling them was the equivalent of taking a penalty kick. Obviously, the chairman had never taken a penalty kick in his life, or he'd have chosen another metaphor for something that was easy. We would normally have been paid 7.5% of the profit, so this new commission structure would in effect cost me £20,000 in lost income a year. I'd already had enough of SLK deals, especially as you had to spend ages with all the wags who kept pestering us about when the car was going to be delivered. You know when you rang last month and I said it would be approximately 5 years before the SLK comes? Well, now it's approximately 4 years and 11 months. Next month, it'll be approximately 4 years and 10 months. See how it works? One of my predecessors had resorted to stealing from the firm, probably in the belief he was getting the money that was actually owed to him. If he had been treated as badly as I had, I could see how he could justify his dirty dealings. But the jury didn't agree, and he got sent to prison for several years. I'm an honest guy, and I also have a fear of confined spaces where there aren't any women. There was no way I was going to do anything underhanded, no matter how cheated I felt. When I started working for myself, there were many times I was asked by salesmen for a dropsy in return for making sure that I got the car that I'd underwritten when it came in. I always refused. This cost me a lot of good cars and a lot of potential profit. I'd never done it when I was a salesman, and I didn't see why they should. But that's the way I've been brought up. Anyway, this leads me to my story. I'd underwritten a car for a local dealer. One of my mates used to be sales manager there, but he'd just been moved on. I'd agreed the deal before he was unceremoniously dismissed. He was far too nice for the job, and his salesmen were taking liberties with his good nature. They were also taking brown envelopes behind his back. That's cash off traders. I'd warned him what would happen, but he'd lost control. Profits were dropping. They were going in the salesman's back pockets and not on his bottom line. And he paid the price with his job. One of the salesmen in particular was as bent as a butcher's hook. He was also obnoxious and I'd refused to deal with him. To my surprise, he'd been made acting sales manager. Talk about putting the wolf in charge of the sheep. It was the first time I'd been back since they gave my mate the elbow, and I wasn't looking forward to it. I'd already decided that I wouldn't be bidding on any more of their cars. The one I was collecting was already pre-sold, and I'd be taking in a part exchange that I could also sell quickly. This would be a good deal. I wanted to pick it up as soon as possible so that I could get it cleaned, delivered and paid for. So I went early. My lift dropped me off across the road from the dealership. I'd been told the car was only due in at 2 p.m, but the dealership was opposite a retail park. I needed to do some shopping and my favourite fast food place was situated there too. I just ordered lunch when I saw the car that I was buying roll up. Pretty soon the customer drove off in his new car. What I wasn't prepared for was when a rival trader, who, to conceal his identity, I will just refer to him as Shithead, turned up and started looking around the car that had been promised to me. I'd fallen out with SH several years earlier, but since then our paths had kept crossing. I banned him from the garage that I'd taken over as manager when he came to sell me some stock. The cars were poor and well overpriced. I told him I wasn't interested. He leaned over my desk to let me into a little secret. He said my predecessor used to buy his cars at an inflated price. Then they'd split the extra money that they'd embezzled out of the firm. I could have the same deal. So had that changed my mind? It had. It had. I never paid him any attention before, but now I thought people who knew what he was like would naturally assume I was taking backhanders off him. So I told him to get out, and that while I was in charge, he needn't bother coming back again. I saw Wolfie, the sales manager, reach into his pocket and take out his mobile. I reached into my pocket and I took out my mobile too. I knew what was about to happen, and sure enough, my mobile rang. Wolfie started speaking. Now, I always knew when Wolfie was lying because his lips moved. I've got some bad news for you. The customer has rung up to say that he sold his car himself and it won't be coming in part exchange now. Oh dear, that is a shame, I said, because I've got some bad news for you too. Look across the road. I waved to him, then added sarcastically, would that be the car that's not coming in part exchange that you stood next to, or am I seeing things? It was hard to say who I disliked the most, Shithead or Wolfie. From what I could see, the car looked nice. My customer would be very happy with it, and I was determined not to let either of them get away with it. The car's been promised to me, and I've pre-sold it, I said. Wolfie replied, sorry, we've invoiced the car now, you've missed it. I took out my mobile in front of them both and made sure that they could hear what I was about to say. I rang the garage and asked to speak to the general manager. I told him there'd been a mistake and a car that had been promised to me had been sold to another dealer. He apologised and tried to console me by saying mistakes do happen. He was an arsehole. He was fobbing me off and he couldn't care less. The GM was now off my Christmas card list too. But that changed when I said, do you mind me asking how much it was sold for? Because I didn't think anyone would have given more than I offered. I thought £5,000 was a fantastic bid. There was silence while he looked at his management system. Then he suddenly took an interest and said, wait a minute, I'm coming down. Wolfie was called into the office and 10 minutes later they both emerged. Apparently, Wolfie was a very gifted liar, or his boss was too stupid to live. It was both. There had been a clerical error, and the car had been mistakenly invoiced out at £4,500. Roughly translated, Wolfie was selling it cheap, but getting a 500 quid dropsy, which he was now going to have to give back. But somewhat amazingly, he was still employed. My story didn't end there though, as Shithead must have had a customer for the car too. Either that, or he just didn't want to be beaten by me. He chimed up, I still want it, and I'll give more money than him. The general manager was an ex-accountant, my favourite. He obviously had no morals either, and I could see the pound signs light up in his eyes. He turned the situation to his advantage, and to settle matters once and for all, came up with the idea of an auction. Me and Shithead had to write a cheque out with a maximum figure we were prepared to pay. The winner's cheque would be banked and they would get the car. To say that I was furious was an understatement. I'd always stood on in the past when their cars had been blatantly misdescribed and were worth less than I'd bid, or they had undisclosed faults and weren't worth it. You have to take the rough with the smooth, they always told me. It seemed like I was still waiting for the smooth. I was just about to give GM and Wolfie both barrels when I had a bright idea. I'd already planted the seed that Wolfie and Shithead's business dealings weren't exactly on the level. Part 2 would be to hit Shithead in the pocket and teach him a lesson he wouldn't forget. I pulled my checkbook out and I began writing furiously. Looking in Shithead's direction, I said, "Nobody gets one over on me. You'll never beat my bid." Shithead picked up the gauntlet and accepted my challenge. He wrote his cheque out and he handed it to the general manager. I folded mine so Shithead couldn't see it and passed it over. The general manager read Shithead's bid out loud. 5,500. To be fair, that was a really good bid and I wouldn't have paid that. I started walking to the door. Shithead was smiling as he thought he'd beat me. I glanced back and winked at him. The GM started to read mine out loud, but then his voice trailed off. On my cheque, written in capital letters, was, "Stick the car up your arse." I've never been back to that garage, but a few weeks later I ran into one of the garage's other salesmen. When Shithead got in the car to drive away, the engine management light was on. It turned out to be an automatic gearbox malfunction, which was to cost £2,500 to repair. I'd had a lucky escape. So all's well that ends well. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video. Bye bye.